Welcome to Rethinking Humanity Interviews. I'm Lacey Delane.
Hi, I'm Sonya Larrea.
And we are so happy to be with you today. It's Friday, the 19th of February. Our month on the theme of love continues. We have with us today Dr. Logan Levkoff. We are so excited to have her. We're going to talk about how we can uplift sex in society. We're going to bring her in just a second. But before we do that, Sonya, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm enjoying, today's a little sunny here in Atlanta. It's chilly.
Yeah.
But I will say, Lacey, I appreciate my warm home and everything I have because, as we know, there's been crazy storms all over the country, specifically in Texas, the Southwest. So I just want to tell people to hang in there, and I'm thinking of them. And, we're all one society. We're all interconnected. So what's happening in other parts of the world or other parts of the country affect us. And I just want to do a shout out to those, that are trying to get power on and, trying to get things back up.
So sad to hear everything that's happening there. So we send our positive vibes, our love and support. As you guys can see, my background is different. I am back in the States. I will tell you more about that on an upcoming episode. And you know what else came with me, Sonya?
What else?
My quiet punch. It made it safely, so all is well.
Awesome. I'm glad you're back, Lacey.
I'm so glad. I'm excited to see you in person soon. So here we go. We're going to introduce Dr. Logan Levkoff. She has done some amazing things. I'm so excited to talk to her. She is an AASECT certified sex educator and sex educator supervisor. She served on the AASECT board of directors. She received her PhD in human sexuality from New York University, and she's written 3 books. One of them is called Got Teens, The Doctor Mom's Guide to Sexuality, Social Media, and Other Adolescent Realities. That was 2014. How to Get Your Wife to Have Sex with You. I'm sure there's a lot of people that would like that. That was from 2010. And Third Base Ain't What It Used to Be. What your kids are learning about sex today and how to teach them to become sexually healthy adults. That sounds really good. As a thought leader in the field of human sexuality and personal relationships, Logan frequently appears on television, including Good Morning America, The Today Show, The Rachel Ray Show, The CBS Early Show, Oprah, Fox News Channel, and CNN. So we are super honored to have her today. Welcome, Dr. Levkoff.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you're in New York City, aren't you?
I am in New York City. So, I feel the same way about everyone who is suffering through the storms and all of the inequities associated with storms now. I mean, we are, I don't know, my window has some flurries outside, but we certainly know how complicated winter months can be. So,
Absolutely.
We are so excited to have you here. This is awesome with our month of theme of love. This fits in perfect from what we're talking about. So we wanted to start out, I want to ask you, is sex sells, right? Everything we see from advertising media is, the sexuality, showing people in these provocative positions. But at the same time, our culture, we have an issue talking about sex. There's a taboo about it. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, without a doubt. I'm always fascinated by the double standards that exist, at least in American culture and society, as it relates to sex, because we use it for everything, right? For things that actually have nothing to do with sex and sexuality, and all of a sudden we have advertisements about it. And then on the flip side, though, we either present sex really as salacious or gratuitous or pornographic, or clinical and scary and shameful and dirty, where most people's sexual lives operate in neither of those categories, but somewhere in the middle. which is quite typical. But we do have incredible double standards. We're allowed to talk about sex under certain parameters and for certain people, and it's not okay for others. And then the flip side of that is that we glorify violence all the time, but are terrified of sex. So it's an interesting place an interesting career space to be in. It's interesting raising children in a world where they're getting lots of mixed messages. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack.
how damaging is it to us as individuals and also as a society to receive these mixed messages? What have you observed that it's doing to us?
Yeah. So I think that the important thing to remember is that sexuality isn't a switch that gets turned on at a particular age, right? It's something that's a part of who we are from birth to death, and we just express our sexuality differently throughout our lives, or we experience and understand it differently throughout our lives. But it's not really limited to what you like to do and who you do it with, which is unfortunately how it's used commonly today. But sexuality really is everything from our gender identity and gender expression, how we communicate with one another, the roles we play in relationships, our body image, I said the roles we play in relationships already, our sexual feelings and desires, just the way in which we choose to express ourselves and be seen in the world around us. So it's so much more than just like what you do with certain body parts. And I think that when we focus sexuality as just behaviors or sexual orientation, we're doing ourselves a huge disservice, right? And we're teaching people that there is a magic switch that gets turned on, and only within certain relationships and within certain communities is that allowed. And it teaches us that we are not entitled to speak up for ourselves, to demand pleasure, to talk about consent. So it presents us with some significant challenges. If we want a certain type of relationship or experience, we have to feel comfortable talking about it and asking for it. But society doesn't always provide not just the opportunity, but the empowering messages to suggest that that's okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, hearing you talk, and you can answer if this is correct or not. So we're born as sexual beings. Mm-hmm. And I think part of that is not acknowledging that from, like you're saying, birth on. And so if the conversation doesn't start happening till a certain age where it's appropriate or whatever, then we've lost that whole time frame of the acceptance of who we are.
Right. I think that's exactly correct. It's a really scary thing for a lot of people to acknowledge that we are sexual beings from birth on, because for whatever reason, there is an assumption that the word sexual means having sex, wanting sex, needing sex, as if it's like one. So that's really scary for people to have to acknowledge, because then it forces us to challenge all of the messages that we've received historically throughout our lives, and people don't really like to do that because it takes work to do that. But you're right. This idea that we spend many years teaching young people that's inappropriate. Wait, it's not the right time. It's not the right time. It's not the right time. And well, I mean, there is no right time. I mean, the right time is when they ask a question or when we have a question or an issue. But what happens is we inadvertently send the message by saying things aren't appropriate, that they're shameful, that you're not supposed to talk about them. You're not supposed to have questions about your body or touch your body or speak up about your body. And really, for a lot of us who are coming of age or becoming adults, like a lot of damage has already been done because we have no language for talking about any of these things.
Yeah, what's interesting is I've worked with kids for most of my life, and I know, and I've nannied as well, and I remember changing a baby boy's diaper at some point, and him having a little erection, and I was like, "Wow, this is like there is an element of us enjoying that is maybe sexual, I guess you could say, from birth." And so that's kind of ties to what you were saying, Sonya. Is like, I think we compartmentalize it. And because of society, we're like, oh, well, after you turn a certain age, then you're sexual. No, we're sexual beings.
Right. Or bodies work, or things happen to bodies because that's how bodies work, right? It's not necessarily about the context. It's that if blood flows through your genitals, that tissue is going to get erect, right? For lots of different reasons. But because we make it so, we think of it in these adult terms, an erection means desire. And yeah, I mean, sometimes it does, but sometimes it's, just because the wind blew in the right direction.
Right. Do you think one of the ways that we start to combat these ideas is through education, through conversation, or what are your thoughts about that?
I'm a big believer in using every opportunity available to us to demythify sex and sexuality. So yeah, it absolutely starts with good, comprehensive, inclusive, ethical, pleasure-focused sexuality education. But the truth is, not every person can do that. Not every system is set up to do that. Not every educator who wants to has access or the skills to do that, right? That especially if they've learned in one particular type of type of educational system that has put a lot of shame and abstinence only focus into the mix. So it's doable, but it doesn't come without challenges. I think it's a partnership with parents and caregivers and medical providers and community members in general to talk about what makes us happy and healthy and fulfilled human beings. It's all of our jobs to do a little bit of the work. It's not just one. I mean, obviously, family, parents, guardians are responsible for giving the values associated with sex and sexuality and relationships. I can't do that in a classroom. I can provide lots of perspectives, but it's not my job to tell people how to think, what to do. Those are deeply personal, but families can do that. But of course, they have to provide facts too. I always tell parent groups when I'm working with them, just to use an old shame message, you might not like that your young people masturbate. Right. You might not like it, right? But you can't tell them they're going to go blind because of it.
Which happens, man. I mean, we've said we wanted to talk about this, but there's so many, there's certainly religious groups and organizations who shame the hell out of sex, and masturbation is like so wrong in their eyes. And so I think that's quite physically unhealthy, physiologically unhealthy for us. I wonder if you could speak to that as well.
Yeah, there are lots of messages in lots of religious or spiritual traditions. Some can be incredibly empowering and positive and welcoming, and some clearly are not, right? That are rooted in shame and actually rooted in a lot of misogyny too. Like let's be honest. It's not exactly like it's not okay for everyone. It's not okay for some of you, right? There's those double standards in action again. But I think, just to use masturbation as an example, there are so many emotional, physical, relationship health benefits from masturbation that we tend to forget. And yeah, obviously pleasure is one of those positive outcomes, but it's actually more than that, right? Because knowing that your body has the capacity for pleasure on its own is empowering. And it also means we don't rely on other people to fulfill us in a way that we can do ourselves. We're not seeking out partners that might not be great partners because we need someone to legitimize the fact that we have these feelings. Wow. Also, I mean, it is really hard from like a strict medical perspective. It's really hard to know when something doesn't feel right for your body or feels off medically from a function perspective, from a feel or visual perspective, if you don't know what the baseline is for your body, right? So if you don't look at your genitals, if you don't see what they're like and how they typically feel, how do you identify when something is off?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. What speaks to me when you bring up pleasure, I think our society, we even have a problem, the puritanical idea that, that we feel pleasure. And like you said, it's not just the sexuality, it's just feeling good. And I do think that definitely there's a misogynistic message there too, because men, I think, are taught culturally a little different than women of what we can expect, how to feel good about ourselves.
Yeah, well, and if you think about how traditional, it takes sex ed off the table, just puberty education, basic 7th grade biology. We spend a lot of time focusing. I mean, it's obviously binary, right? Let's just acknowledge that. There's not a lot of discussion about anyone who isn't assigned male or female. So the concept of even discussing people who are intersex is usually omitted from a conversation, but, which is bad enough. In addition to that, most of how we focus puberty education is on erections and ejaculation. And even though there is fluid that might come out of the penis one day, there is an innate conversation about pleasure that takes place in those conversations, which is great. I mean, for everyone. On the flip side, we spend a lot of time focusing on the uterus and menstruation and solely on our reproductive potential, and don't spend a lot of time talking about the vulva, the clitoris, how the clitoris and penis are basically exactly the same, just arranged differently. So even in an educational setting, we say you're set up for reproductive potential. We never even acknowledge innate pleasure. You're set up for reproductive potential, but it's going to be fun for you.
Yeah. That's true. That's true.
Wow. Look at that. The contrast, man. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, I think back to my own education. I've had this conversation many times over. I mean, I know the word clitoris was never, ever used until probably I was a sexual health educator in college.
Amazing. Which speaks to me also on the parent side. So if you are a parent who's been raised with those taboo issues, it's got to be challenging to then talk to your child about the sexuality that you can't even acknowledge within yourself.
Very challenging. The one thing I ask parents, and really any adult figure in a young person's life, right? Because not everyone is a parent, but everyone has people around them that they impact in some way. I often ask people to think about how their lives might have been different if the messages they received about sex and sexuality were different. And that's really the first step, right? Before you can convince people to change the messaging or like stop the cycle of the same messaging, you have to get buy-in. And part of that buy-in comes from people thinking about, maybe those messages didn't set me up for success. Maybe my choices would have been different. Maybe I would have found my voice earlier. Maybe my experiences would have been a lot more pleasurable. My partners would have been more equitable and thoughtful. So I think the first thing is to ask that, right? How would it have been different? And then to think about, okay, now that you know that, how do we start conversations that we're not always comfortable with, that we don't always have all the information about, and take ownership of that. And some of that comes simply from saying to the people in your life, I want to have these conversations with you. I'm nervous about it because I didn't have these conversations and they certainly weren't positive, but I want to do better for you. Right. And that's a really powerful position to come from. And it lets the people in your life know that you're human too, right? We're fallible, we're imperfect, and we don't always have the information, but that's okay.
Yeah, I think it speaks to a need for some humility and just being able to communicate effectively about feelings and about reality. I think there's a lot of pressure in our society to know all the answers. And when we can come to a place where we can say, look, I don't know all the answers, but I'll share with you what I do know and do it in an effective way. That's really powerful. And that can be a challenge sometimes.
It can definitely be a challenge, especially as an adult, to admit that you don't you don't know everything. I constantly acknowledge that I don't know everything. I mean, I have an almost 12-year-old and an almost 16-year-old, and there are definitely things that they know that I don't know, and that's okay. I think it's just an old school thought to think that you can only be taught by people who are older than you. Right? I think learning takes place up and down the generational ladders, and there's perspective to that we need to be exposed to in order to grow as human beings. So I'm certainly constantly willing to learn from them as much as they're willing to learn from me.
That's a good approach. I wanted to ask you too, one of the things that Lacey and I have touched upon before is how does abuse fit into the sexuality? You know, you hear, there's a lot of stories, and like I told Lacey, probably every woman I've ever met has had some instance of abuse. And I don't know if this speaks to suppression of sexuality in our society or where this is coming from, that it's so prevalent, and what your experience has been with that.
So lots of people have experienced trauma and abuse across all genders, right? The issue, I mean, even starting from there, it's probably important to recognize that we don't always leave room for people who are male or male, identified in some way to even discuss those things, because we have this weird idea that abuse is linked to masculinity or lack thereof, and you speak up about something, then what does that mean about you as a man? So that's problematic as well. I think that without a doubt, our inability to have language for our bodies, to talk about pleasure, to talk about things that don't necessarily feel good, often comes from our unwillingness to have conversations about sex and sexuality. If we create taboos around all of these things, we are not going to speak up or disclose when something is good, and we are not going to speak up and disclose if something is bad. Right? And that cycle continues because we just pass along that guilt and that shame and that trauma. And I think that I can't speak to, why people abuse, but what I would say is I think that we have these really problematic expectations of relationships, of sex, and the way in which we are supposed to exist as sexual beings, these old models rooted in these double standards, right? And these fairly rigid definitions of femininity and masculinity. And all of that perpetuates a lot of the unhealthy behaviors in people's relationships. And in turn is why we don't speak up, because we think, this is what's supposed to happen because I'm this person and they're that person.
Oh, wow. Oh my goodness. And also, from a female perspective, I'm not necessarily supposed to enjoy this. It's not really about me enjoying it. It's about him enjoying it. Is that something that you've seen a lot of in your work as a pattern with women?
Well, just the idea of pleasure with women could be really challenging, because oftentimes we don't, let's go back to pop culture for a second. If our only images of sex, and in this case, we'll talk about, heterosexual sex, is everyone sort of immediately feeling desire, right? At any moment, my partner comes home, I can drop my pants and I'm ready to go. And it's always pleasurable and everyone's always screaming and it looks so fabulous. If my experiences aren't that, and by the way, most people's experiences are not that,
right.
We start to think, when we don't have these open conversations and reality checks about sex and desire and equity, we start to think that there's something wrong with us, right? Perpetuates that, it's about you, I'm not supposed to feel this, or I'm broken because I don't feel those things, and I'm not going to speak up because there's something wrong with me. And then there's a third option, right? Because if everyone is experiencing pleasure all the time, we look at the partner we're with and think, well, if I'm not feeling that, there's something wrong with you. Right? So,
okay, yeah.
None of it's good, really. Right. None of it is good.
I would also speak to, with women, at least this is my thought process, is there's this performance that women are supposed to put on, right? No, irrelevant of how you're feeling, the idea is to get the man, or to get, someone to like you. You have to go through these activities that maybe you don't even want to do.
Yeah. Performative expressions of sexuality and pleasure, I think, have never been successful for us, for any of us, right? We never get what we want if it's not genuine and authentic to us.
That's right.
So if the end goal is by the way, whatever the end goal is, if it's consensual non-monogamy, if it is monogamy, if it's a one-night experience, whatever it is,
right?
Going through the motions because you think that's what's expected of you is never going to get you to what you want in the end.
That's an unhealthy way to do anything: sex, life, work, whatever it is. If you're just a machine at that point that's performing for someone else instead of, embodying yourself and really like being who you are.
But we do it a lot, and we cross our fingers and hope that the other person or people are going to magically figure out or intuit what we want, which also doesn't really ever happen.
Yeah, I also think people use sex as power, right? Like, I'm giving this person, so I'm going to get something back. Maybe it's not pleasure. Maybe it's a financial stability or something, whatever it's used for different motives, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's okay to say that people's contributions to relationships are different, all meaningful, but not every, some people have a greater emotional burden. Some people have a greater financial burden, but in the end, in order for a partnership, again, whether it's for a minute or a lifetime or anywhere in between, all of those contributions have to be respected and valued.
Good point.
Right? They're all important. Like the structure runs because of everyone's involvement.
Right.
True.
Everybody's engaging. And so that's why it's actually a thing. I love what you said about masturbation. I think that's very empowering, realizing that we ourselves can give ourselves what we need. And we don't have to be dependent on someone else outside of us for that. And obviously it's wonderful when we can have that experience. But I really like how empowering that is, the idea and that thought process.
Yeah, I want to help to raise the next generation of people who really feel empowered by their bodies, who know what their bodies are capable of, who don't need to rely on other people, but should they choose to share their bodies with another person, that their experience is enhanced by that, but it's not something they need to rely on. I remember years ago, I was doing a TV show and I was saying that one of the questions that I got most often from men, or one of the comments, was that they wanted to learn how to pleasure their female partners, but their partners wouldn't speak up and explain it to them. And I thought, first of all, amazing question, and breaking the idea that partners don't really care about someone else's pleasure, that they're only in it for their own. But when I had this conversation and said this comment, some of the women in the audience were so angry that that they said, someone said to me, "Are you telling me I don't pleasure my man?" I said, no, that has absolutely nothing to do with it. What I'm saying is that the success of an experience is going to depend on whether or not you can both communicate your needs, but you can't look at someone else and think they're going to magically read your mind. I mean, especially if they don't live in the same type of body, because they have no idea how it works. And if you don't know how it works, well, then that's another problem too.
Right. Yeah. How can a woman tell a man what to do that makes her feel good if she doesn't know it herself?
Yeah. But people do that all the time, right? Because if you don't encourage people to explore their bodies and think about what feels fulfilling, and fulfilling has a lot of different potential definitions, then we expect that someone else is going to figure it out, right? Because I know I'm supposed to feel pleasure, but I'm not the one who's supposed to figure it out. So I guess it's on them.
Right. And especially when we have been told, don't masturbate. That's not okay.
Yeah.
It's certainly understandable that we're in a place where we're like, okay, well, I guess it'll just magically happen. I don't have to know myself. I don't have to know my body. I don't have to communicate that. And the guy should just figure it out.
Yeah. and the language we use around that too. I mean, I'm a big believer in using correct anatomical terms. Like I don't really care what people use with friends or at home, but like from a universal language perspective, I think it's important that we understand that body parts have correct names. I don't like interchangeable names. I don't like names that are like pejorative, that are meant to like infantilize body parts. I don't like any of that. Or I don't like these generic terms like private parts. And the reason for that is, I mean, okay, so for the most part, you see these parts in the privacy of like your own room or bathroom or whatever. And the parts are personal to you, meaning that you are in control of them. But I think particularly for young people, if you hear that something is private over and over and over again for like 5, 6, 7, 8 years, that word private becomes synonymous with secretive.
Yes.
Which means we're not going to talk about it. We're afraid to talk about it. There's some shame built into it. And sometimes doctors do that too, right? I've had over the course of, my eldest is a teenager, doctors who have used certain terms like, we need to examine your private parts. I'm like, well, we don't use that term. I'm like, so you can use the real term. Please use the real term, and you can certainly still ask them for their consent, but just we don't need to pretend it doesn't have a name.
Well, I'm curious, doctor, if you in your studies have seen cultures that do better than, say, the American culture, like throughout the world, like maybe in Europe or in other countries. I'd just be fascinated to know maybe where they do a better job. Or I know there's areas I'm sure they're struggling with all these issues, but I'd love to hear your perspective.
There's always been a lot of work that the Netherlands typically does some really amazing work in the sexuality space, especially with parent-child conversations and this really early education about sex and sexuality in this beautifully shame-free way. I do think there's opportunity for growth in the States in this area. There's always room for improvement, but I tend to think that we often don't. Let me backtrack for a second. The majority of people in the United States want their young people to have access to high quality comprehensive sex ed, right? Like they don't want the alternative. Right. But the problem is oftentimes in school systems, you don't really know what's being taught. If there's anything that's being taught, who's teaching it, what's their particular perspective, and then it becomes super political. So it's on us in our communities, and not even just as parents or guardians in the community, but like as community members to find out what is being taught to the young people who are living in this area. And am I okay with it? The statistics on sex ed in the United States, some of it is so just. There are not all states require medically accurate sex ed in this country. I mean, just think about that for 1 second. Like I could go into a class and just make shit up, and apparently it's okay.
Oh my God!
I mean, I don't do that clearly, but not every state has to provide medically accurate.
That is insane. That is shocking, and it's not.
I know.
But I mean, the initial response is you laugh because it's so absurd.
It's absurd.
It's not funny. It's not.
Right. I mean, and think about, to both of your earlier questions, how much our adult experiences or feeling sexually oppressed or shameful in some way start from all of that. So imagine someone deliberately lying to you about your body or about your relationships or your family structures.
Now, statistically, and I don't know the statistics, are kids having sex earlier nowadays or not? Because, there's different things out there. Okay. Yeah,
they're not. So it's always funny to me because I think we tend to deliberately forget, that the hallmark of adolescence is exploring and expressing your sexuality. Doesn't mean that everyone does, but that is a 5 to 7 year time frame where you are figuring out your body and how you wanted to exist in the world, potentially with someone else. I don't know when we all of a sudden, or at what age we deliberately forget that that's an important part of adolescence, but we do, because we do a lot of those. Adolescents are bad. Adolescents are incapable of making smart decisions about sex. All of these sensationalist, alarmist headlines. And in reality, it's not true. In terms of penis and vagina intercourse, the average of first sexual vaginal intercourse really has not changed in all of these years. And in fact, lately it was going down prior to COVID, and now it's gone down again. Young people aren't really having a lot of sex at all, which to me comes with its own challenges.
Right.
Of course. I mean, that's the time of your life that you're set to develop in that way. So if you're skipping that can't be a good thing.
Well, it's also, part of it is finding out how your body works, but it's also in developing those really critical intimacy skills, being able to talk about feelings, learning how to flirt, learning how to deal with rejection, figuring out all of those social dynamics, which are so critical to who we become as adults and how we operate in our adult relationships. I was feeling badly about our young people prior to March of last year. I'm feeling a hell of a lot worse now, because all of those opportunities they don't have access to.
Yeah.
I was telling Lacey that this morning because I read an article about the depression, and we're talking about the age, the kind of adolescent age, and even going into college, that they're just demoralized of not being able to communicate, interact, personally with their peers, and being isolated. I told her I would be so depressed if I was living that lifestyle.
It's hard. It's really hard. And I was saying to my son has given me consent to share this story, but I said to him the other day he wanted to go out for lunch with some of his friends. They were going to pick up sandwiches and meet in the park. And so I yelled out behind him, I'm like, be careful, be safe. Do you have a mask? Do you have Purell? The works. And then when he came home, I said to him, I have to tell you, I feel so badly because I'm supposed to be saying, be safe and careful to you, but it's not supposed to be about that. Right? It's supposed to be about lots of other things. And I think that there's going to come a point where a lot of adults who are raising teenagers now in some way are going to have to own the fact that this is a sad time for young people.
It's a grief, it's a loss for them. That's how I feel. So I hear you. It's tough.
Yeah. And single people too. It's not nearly as impactful, I would imagine, because, young single people who are already adults are not developing in their sexuality, right? But it's still impactfve. It is difficult. It's like really, really, really difficult.
Well, and also young adults and 20-somethings, 30-somethings are also figuring out the types of relationships they want. And maybe they're at a place now where they get it. They know how they want to connect with someone else, the type of relationship or partnership they might want. And then all of a sudden you throw a giant wrench into any potential connection that you have. Though I will say the tried and true peer health educator in me loves the idea that now we have to talk about masks the way we talk about condoms. So I think it's an important skill to have to learn to have tough conversations about risk management and health decisions. And I think it'll help with masks. And I also think it's going to help with safer sex too. The more
actually, speak to the safer sex, because I know you had a big promotion with the condoms. So talk to us about that.
Yeah. So I started in this field when I was 15 years old. I was a peer HIV and AIDS educator because it was this really beautiful blip in time in the early 1990s where, in my community anyway, HIV was being discussed as a virus that didn't discriminate. It wasn't about race. It wasn't about sexual orientation or gender or nationality. It was It was an opportunistic virus, and there were a few ways you got it, and that was it. And my parents became very involved in education and fundraising efforts for HIV and AIDS education. And my mom and her best friend started our neighborhood's first HIV and AIDS awareness program that wound up training teenagers to talk about safer sex and HIV risk to school systems in all of the neighborhoods. So I came home after school one day and there were condoms and bananas on my dinner table. My parents were like, this is how you use a condom. And next week you become a peer trainer. And it wasn't like we were so liberal. It was that, there was something at stake. And as a responsible adult, you couldn't stick your head in the sand and say, I'm going to let someone else do this.
Yeah.
So I have been a proud proponent of condoms forever. I love them. I think they're so important, and they are an incredibly important tool for people to have access to. So yeah, I do a lot of, it's National Condom Week. It's depending on how you look at it, but there's so much misinformation still about condoms. The pictures we see are all the condoms from the 1980s. They look different. There's so many innovations. So it's important to remember that the sexual health field has definitely gotten bigger and also better.
So condoms, let me ask you. So the old idea was that men didn't feel pleasure with the condoms. So obviously that's a myth, because there's probably all kinds out there.
So the biggest problem with that myth. Now, look, does sex with a condom feel different than sex without a condom? Sure. I mean, okay. I mean, it's also still sex, and the lubricants on them are really good. It doesn't mean you can't experience pleasure. I mean, is it different? Sure, it's different. But I think that myth gets perpetuated down the generational line, so to speak, and people start repeating that before they've actually ever had any sexual experience before. Which is frustrating, because if I'm sitting in a classroom with 15-year-olds and they're like, well, I know condoms don't feel good. I'm like, how do you know that? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah.
Have you had the ability to compare and contrast? So I think that's a real challenge that we have, and part of that gets perpetuated by sex educators when we don't talk about all of the innovations, when we don't talk about all of the new statistics or new ways to look at sexual health. So I will never apologize for being pro condom. If you or a partner has a penis, external condoms are a really important tool. They just are. And they're super easy and accessible, which everyone forgets about access, right? Like,
that's true. That's
an issue.
Good point.
Well, we're very fortunate for that in this country, and that birth control is accessible, widely available. There's not really a stigma, I don't think, not like in other countries here. So that's a gift. We're very fortunate for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's always room for improvement. We can make things less expensive and more accessible, and we can deal with the insurance issue. I mean, I keep thinking that Rush. Rush went after Sandra Fluke and called her a slut for advocating for healthcare access to contraception. So the stories just keep coming.
Yeah, that's a huge one. I think the accessibility, because not everyone has the means to purchase birth control. So that is important. And like you're saying, well, the story you told about your parents is so cool, because how awesome is that you come home, there's the bananas and the condoms. Like, I don't think a lot of people have that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you ask my parents if they had thought that at that very moment it was going to foreshadow the rest of my life, never believed it. And again, it wasn't. I don't see myself as having such a liberal household, though. I will say that I grew up with a younger sister, and it was my father, our father in particular, who said to us, sex and sexuality are really important parts of your life. And there are no double standards in our home because you're both girls. And whenever you make a decision, I will be okay with it if it's something that you want and you're protected, and it's not because a partner is demanding it of you. Mm. And that always has lingered in my head, that message. And at the time, particularly from our father, was a pretty powerful.
That's a big deal. That's a very big deal. I mean, I would imagine that most kids don't have a conversation with their parents about sex. Many.
A lot don't. I will say my kids are obviously at this point the exception, not the rule. I always laugh when my kids go to school and they have the health workshops where someone comes in and says, I'm sure no one has conversations about sex at the dinner table. And my kids are like, actually, we do. We do. It's like talking about, whatever's on the television at the very moment. We have these conversations ad infinitum.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to tell you a personal thing, listening to you talk. My daughter, when she was growing up, I was really close to her friends. They would come to me for advice. And I found it was way easier for me to talk to them and be vulnerable than talk to her. It's interesting. And I don't know, I think it's the parent-child thing, because they would just share everything and I'd be telling them what I thought and giving them support. But it's a little more challenging with your child. At least that was my experience.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way because maybe it's this perception that the stakes are higher with your own child, that if you say something, and again, depending on who your kid is, are there some kids that use our material against us? Sure, right? And I think sometimes we don't want to necessarily say the wrong thing and have it come back to haunt us, and where it just feels like it's easier with other people because they're still going to go back and perhaps check against their values in their own home. So I absolutely understand the challenge that lots of people have. And again, if you don't have models for this,
right,
your parents did not talk to you in a way that was helpful, I should say, it's really hard to do it for your own children, which is why we need to break past that discomfort and just say, you know what, my job is to send you out into the world ready and capable of tackling everything that the world throws at you. And that includes talking about sex.
Yeah. And I just thought of something that Lacey and I talk a lot about. Our world, you're kind of encapsulated in your little family instead of a community. And I believe that a community would be, we need to live more communal. So you have other resources, other adults, other people that you can trust, because the way our culture is now, it's more, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You're kind of isolated. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that all of the different people, groups, systems within a community can be helpful in rearing healthy people. Mm-hmm. And different perspectives are important. I don't anticipate that my kids are going to do or believe every single thing that I believe in exactly the same way, but I hope they get enough perspectives that they can make an informed decision that best reflects their own values. I think about it a lot. I'm Jewish, and I've done a lot of work, actually, sex ed work within the Jewish community, and I'm super appreciative of having that opportunity, but also so appreciative when religious or spiritual communities are willing to talk about these issues with not just adults, but with young people, and creating a space to have these really important conversations in a setting that people assume isn't willing to talk about intimate issues.
Look at that. I like it.
Yeah, and everything from, not just, explicit sexual health, but gender and identity. And it's been really incredible. So yeah, there are plenty of places that don't do those things, but there are also a lot that do. And we should certainly give them credit because, when we think about the community in its broadest sense, places of worship and faith and spiritual places do provide a lot of values and sometimes surprise us with what they're willing to talk about.
True.
That's encouraging, that the story you're telling right now. It is important, like you said, to have the spaces where you have trust and support.
Yeah. That's key. And sometimes simply being there, just to say, I'm here to listen. I'm not here to judge. I'm not here to tell you what you should do. I'm here to be a sounding board. And if you want my perspective, I'll give it to you. But in the end, you'll know what the right decision is for you. And I don't think we do that a lot with young people. We're very quick to say what we think they should do and not give them a lot of credit, which is not great for future relationship skills and relying on the adults in their life.
Exactly.
Decisions for them.
That is correct. How can they become that independent decision maker?
They won't. They can't.
Exactly. Wow. I think it's interesting to talk to about the sex positive movement. Is that a thing, a sex positive movement, or just being sex positive? I think that's something our listeners might enjoy knowing a little bit more about, and probably fits in with everything that we're talking about at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different terms for different movements within the sexuality community. I think at its core, the idea of sex positive means that we lead from a place where sex and sexuality are good, right? They're not something we should be ashamed of or feel badly about. They should be something that we are empowered by, as well as empowered to learn and more about. I do think that where the sexuality education movement has been and is moving more into is this idea of inclusivity. So, I mean, not just racial, ethnic, gender, but disability, body shape and size. I mean, there is so much that when I think about what it means to be sexually healthy, and I think there are a lot of ways that we define that, and a lot of different pillars within that category. The one thing I really believe is that so much of our ability to be sexually healthy depends on whether or not we see ourselves represented.
Yeah.
Whether we see that we exist, that we are entitled to be a part of a conversation, to have a sexuality, to have a voice, to experience pleasure. So we as a community, as a profession, I think we are doing a better job. I think we have a long way to go. But it's really important. The representation piece impacts our self-esteem, our ability to consent, to have a voice, to talk about pleasure and equity. So, I mean, all the trajectory is a positive one, but there's always room. Always room.
Always. Sure. Yeah. Always.
That's exciting.
So as we wrap up, I want to know, other than your own, which I'm certainly checking out, what books do you recommend for folks? Most of our listeners are book folks. We're definitely book folks.
Yeah. There's some wonderful books out there. And of course, every time someone asks me for a book, my mind goes blank, and then I forget every book that I've read in the last few years. Okay. From a desire, from an understanding desire perspective, I think that Dr. Emily Nagoski's Come As You Are is top notch. My friend is sex therapist Ian Kerner. He has a new book coming out, I want to say in the next couple of months, and I don't remember the title, but having to do with sex and intimacy and partnerships. I just helped review a book. Megan Stubbs is a sexologist, Dr. Megan Stubbs, and has a book coming out, I want to say maybe in April, called, it starts with the word playing. It's about the ways to experience sexual pleasure as someone who's unpartnered, which gets back to the whole conversation about masturbation, right. which is a really enjoyable and fresh way of thinking about sex and sexual pleasure, regardless of one's relationship status. So there's always lots of good stuff.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's so helpful. Well, we'll be checking those out, and then of course checking your books out. And what do you have going on in your life right now? What are you date on a daily basis? Are you working with couples? How?
Yeah, so I'm an educator by profession, a sexuality educator. So most of my life was prior to March of last year, spent in classrooms. So I design and implement the sex ed programs in about 8 schools in Manhattan and Brooklyn and the surrounding areas. That's like my weekly life, which I miss very much because I'm teaching a little bit virtually. But it's sexuality education is, there is a dance to it. There's a performance aspect of it. And I don't mean that in a superficial way. It's about connecting with the people in front of you and them knowing that you see them and that you respect them and that they matter. And that's hard to do via Zoom. Way. So I'm doing a lot less teaching these days, sadly, just because schools are barely getting it together. Right. Sex ed is not necessarily top of the priority list for them right now, sadly. Because puberty and sexuality go on, even if you're not in Absolutely. It stops for COVID. But I eagerly anticipate being back with my students, and that's my day-to-day life. My day-to-day life is primarily working with young people, and doing what I think that as an adult I wish I had in a classroom.
Wow, that's awesome. Just being able to give back like that. That's awesome. That's what I want to do too. Well, thank you so much for being here. I think this has been a super enlightening conversation, helpful for how we can rethink the way we approach sexuality as individuals and as a society. And we had a blast. So
yeah, this was awesome. We'll be posting all of your information so people can check it out. But I love this. I could talk about this for hours. So it's very, very informative, very, very good.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, I am a big believer that the root of most of our issues societally comes from our inability to speak kindly about sex and sexuality. So to give me a platform to rant on that is always a fun thing for me. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And thank you all for listening, and we will see you next time.
Take care.